Like we had a situation where government debt from Confederation to 2015 was $600 billion. 2015 to 2023, $600 billion. We had the Prime Minister and Governor Macklin saying money was essentially free, interest rates would be low forever, and they just borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, and now interest rates have gone up, which eats away at the pie that we can use to pay for services. So isn't there some blame on the government for blowing the bank?
Look, we faced a situation in March of 2020 where we really didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know what COVID was going to do and how we were going to control it. So I think you sat here in 2020 and you had to make decisions. The government had to make decisions on how to deal with it. And I think it's very hard to fault the decision at that time. We did not know at that time what we were up against. I think it's much more, your comment is much more trenchant with respect to what happened after the second half of 21, right? I think that is much more trenchant when we should have known better, although most economists on the outside, not me, but most economists on the outside thought that we would come through this relatively easy, that rates would not go up, and there were only a few of us that kept warning, quite frankly, that we were going to be into high rates.
Thank you.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Just curious, the government top-line spending is about 28% above pre-COVID levels. So forget all about the COVID pandemic spending. Annual spending this year is up about 28% versus pre-COVID levels. Does that represent a slowing of spending in your mind?
In real terms, it is up, and in real terms, it's actually appropriate that it's up. It's the question of how much and what it is spent on.
Fair enough. If you think that the government really only has one lever with respect to inflation, were you surprised when members of the government claimed that the government's plan to bring inflation down is working when in 1 month out of 28%, inflation dropped below the 3% target of the Bank of Canada?
This is going to take time to bring inflation down. Once we got off track, just as we know in the 70s, once we got off track, it takes time. And it takes a lot of effort on the part of the government, and it takes a lot of effort on the part of the central bank.
Government fiscal policy and bank monetary policy are working together. And I want to bring you back to something you said in 2002 at the Donald Gow lecture. You talked about policy coordination and cooperation. You said that inflation targets are joint targets of the bank and of the government, and that when the government changes fiscal policy, it needs to think of how these changes will affect inflation and consequently interest rates. Those were your words back then. Now, we know recently Mr. Manley has talked about his quote, which became known in the media, about pressing the gas and the brake at the same time. I wonder if you think, under the present circumstances, that the federal government's fiscal policy is working at cross purposes to the bank's attempts with regard to quantitative tightening to try and get rid of some of the bonds that they had to acquire, and the increasing of interest rates.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd use the word cross purposes. All I would say is that it's not providing additional disinflationary pressure at the moment. And I think that is correct, although in very strict measurement terms, because the deficit actually has been coming down, this year is less bad than last year, if you will.
I suppose that's something. But the reality is we saw new spending announced in the spring of about $60 billion. At the same time that the bank is trying to get inflation under control. You yourself said, I think recently, that unless inflation gets under control within the next, 18 months, you said, that we're going to be in for a return to, use the words, pretty awful era between the 1970s and 80s, characterized by a lack of pricing predictability and social upheaval. Do you think that, I know you just said that a couple months ago, but are you concerned that, in your words, that the federal government has not provided any disinflationary incentive because of its spending, that we're not going to get there and that we will be in for a pretty awful era?
Once you lose control, and once people feel that inflation is not in control, then it actually requires much more effort to keep it down or to get it back than when people have confidence. And so I think it's absolutely true that at the moment, the level of confidence, certainly the level of confidence in financial markets, that we have things fully under control, is not there. And therefore, there's a term premium on interest rates because there's a worry that we will not be at 2% again.
Oh.
Thank you, Governor. Just one other quick thing. You said that budgets will need to be roughly balanced in your opening remarks. Do you have any confidence that this government is in any position to do that? They promised to balance the budget by 2019, and you know that in the fall economic statement they had promised a surplus in 27-28 of $4.5 billion, and then in the spring budget they completely reversed that, forecasting a $14 billion deficit in 27-28. How can anyone have any confidence that they're gonna be able to take your advice?
I don't think any government has an easy time in balancing the budget. Doesn't matter what government it is. It doesn't matter when it is. That is always true. But this is particularly difficult at the moment, as I tried to point out in my opening remarks, because governments need to make very large investments, and they need to provide room for the private sector to make very large investments. And that's very difficult to do when you have to continue to strike a balance. Because what it means is that the other items which are important have to get less. And so that is the terrible job, and I use those words advisedly, the terrible job of governing is that you have to make the choices then of how you strike that balance. It's not easy.
Another paper you co-wrote in January with Mr. Aslan, you talked about, one of your conclusions was that you thought there was a high risk that the government would not be able to deliver the promises it made in the 2022 budget and the fall economic statement. Then you said, if anything, even more spending and borrowing might be required in order to deliver its policies. And, I think it's pretty clear to me that you're basically sending a message to the government that they need to get their spending under control, while at the same time investing in infrastructure and trying to grow the economy. I get that from your opening remarks. But I'm wondering if you could comment on that particular conclusion.
Yeah, this is the unfortunate fact of life, that indeed, if you're going to deliver a service, there's a real cost to delivering that service. And some of those services that collectively we look on governments to provide in particular health, education, security services. The cost of actually providing those services in real terms is going up over time, right? It's very hard to deliver that promise and indeed to expand on that promise as to what you're going to deliver without devoting more revenues to it. And so it's what I was saying is that given that those things are costly and they were promised, then indeed I was very worried that the amount of revenue the government was going to have was totally insufficient to deliver on the service delivery that is promised. And that's not just this government here in Ottawa. That is a collective problem that governments are having in the provinces, in Europe, and a fortiori are having in the United States.
So, in terms of the revenue question, I mean, one of the things government can do is raise taxes. Now, as conservatives, we hate that. But do you think that's something that is in play?
Well, I don't think anyone likes paying taxes, but the taxes are there to pay for the services that the government delivers, and to allow government on its part to make the investments in its services, in the future of its services, and at the same time to ensure that it has a tax structure that allows the private sector to make the investment it needs to make.